And with that, I will now recognize the ranking member, the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From a constitutional perspective, which is, after all, the purview of this subcommittee, the answer to the question posed by today's hearing, the extent to which states can act independently of the federal government with respect to immigration matters, including border enforcement, has been well-settled law for over 150 years. The Supreme Court has been unequivocal that the Constitution does not allow states to reject federal policy and set up their own immigration regimes, and that when a state purports to stand in the federal government's shoes and take over federal immigration enforcement, it unlawfully violates the principle that the removal process is entrusted to the discretion of the federal government. So why is this hearing happening today? To try to breathe life into a crackpot legal theory that is so extreme that even hardcore conservative scholars have rejected it, declaring correctly that this is an attempt to subvert our constitutional order for political purposes. Federal supremacy over immigration rests on several constitutional bases. These include the federal government's inherent power over the conduct of U.S. relations with foreign countries, including with respect to matters of national security, and its power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization as provided for in Article 1, Section 8. Federal law governing immigration is the supreme law of the land, and state laws may not undermine the comprehensive and complex federal regulatory framework governing immigration. We cannot have 50 different sets of immigration laws, each of them potentially having different foreign relations and national security implications. Such a system would be chaotic. It would leave the country vulnerable, and it would make Americans less safe. That is why the Constitution's framers entrusted those matters to the national government to the exclusion of the states. Attempts by the states to enact and implement their own immigration enforcement policies that conflict with federal law are clearly unconstitutional. In pressing the extreme and unconstitutional legal theories that the House majority and its witnesses are making today, they're attempting to put the rabbit in the hat, even as they're blocking bipartisan legislation to address border security and funding. They're arguing that the federal government's failure to have a stronger border security gives states a license to enact their own immigration policies. So this is a fallacy. Our Constitution doesn't say the states are free to ignore the Constitution and Supreme Court precedent unless the House Freedom Caucus gets its way. It is Congress's responsibility to enact immigration legislation and the funding necessary to implement it. Enacting such legislation requires compromise, bipartisanship, and actually voting on measures which can be signed into law. But the House majority is not interested in meeting that responsibility and has blocked the president's request for supplemental border funding and is now refusing to even consider a bipartisan border security bill that has been hammered out by Senate Democrats and Republicans with the administration. And they've done so at the urging of the disgraced former president who wants to campaign on lies about border security. As we will see, the fringe legal fantasy being pushed in this hearing and by some state officials hinges on a tortured reading of the Constitution that defies both constitutional history and legal precedent. They're promoting the idea that the states have the power to take matters into their own hands because they're being invaded, and they claim that that meets the language of Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 of the Constitution. Our founders and credible legal scholars are clear that the Invasion Clause refers to protection against armed hostility from a nation-state or organized political entity, not people fleeing danger in their home country and seeking protection under international and U.S. asylum laws, and not even from those engaging in criminal activity. And we should be clear that the courts have considered the volume of immigrants coming to our border when repeatedly reaffirming that this migration crisis does not equal an invasion. I cannot decide which is more disturbing, the torturous attempt to evade the clear constitutional order or the racist dog whistles and inflammatory and demagogic rhetoric being used to justify this invasion argument. We also need to be mindful of the damage done to our constitutional order when advocates for this extremist position are really saying that states are not bound by federal law or Supreme Court decisions with which they disagree. It is disturbing when the chair of the House Judiciary Committee on the Constitution posts on social media that Texas should ignore the Supreme Court's decision last week after the court held the federal government could remove razor wire that Texas had unlawfully placed at the border. The truth is that Republicans in the House, some state officials, and the national leader of the Republican Party want to block bipartisan action on immigration reform so that they can campaign on the issue. They want to grandstand in Camo at the Rio Grande and impeach officials so they can campaign on bluster and boogeymen rather than doing the hard work of actually solving problems. That's why today's hearing is yet another irresponsible and potentially dangerous exercise in taxpayer-funded political theater. We need to enact legislation to address border issues rather than just have campaign talking points. And with that, I would seek unanimous consent to introduce the Supreme Court's opinion in Arizona versus United States, 132 Supreme Court 2492 from 2012.
Without objection.
And a Washington Post article published yesterday, January 29th, 24, entitled "Republicans Now Say It Might Be Okay to Ignore the Supreme Court."
Definitely without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.